Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Paradigm Shifters Book Club. Now this is part 5 of Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice by Rupa Maria and Raj Patel. And I'm going to call this episode the Psychological Inflamators. In the last video, part 4 of this series, I talked about 5 physical causes of chronic inflammation that can potentially lead to chronic inflammatory diseases like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, asthma, autoimmune disease, depression, and more. Super quick, those inflammators were depleted soils, synthetic chemicals used in agriculture, antibiotics used in industrial farming, poor diet, and fossil-fueled air pollution. And I also talked about steps that we can all take to reduce or eliminate the toxic impacts of those inflammators individually and collectively. But I wasn't finished. I said I was going to talk about 8 inflammators in total, right? Now, have you noticed how sometimes you can do all of the greatest lifestyle changes and you still get inflammatory issues like excess weight gain, skin outbreaks, high blood pressure, or more? Clean diet and exercise can sometimes make a huge difference, and sometimes not so much. And that is really frustrating. Now, why does that happen? What else could be going on? Well, guess what? Chemical toxins or nutritional deficits in our environment are not the only big inflammators. We have to talk about the highly inflammatory potentials of psychological stress and trauma, both present and past. What the world has not yet grasped is that psychological stress and trauma can have a tremendously inflammatory effect in our bodies, even to the extent of leading to chronic or even fatal inflammatory disease. And the idea that emotional stress and trauma can make us seriously ill used to be poo-pooed. It was dismissed as superstition. Well, that's a thing of the past. Unresolved emotional stress can devastate the body, and the pathway through which it does that is now really clearly understood. Chronic psychological stress disrupts the microbiome in the gut, which causes the gut to get inflamed, which then can inflame other body systems. The pathway from psychological trauma to disease is inflammation. So let's go ahead and talk about the 3 remaining big inflammators, the psychological inflammators, and then we'll talk about what we can do together to reduce the inflammatory impact of psychological trauma. Okay, remember we already did 5 in the last video, so here comes big inflammator number 6. Personal stress. If you've ever found yourself more prone to catching a cold or flu when you're emotionally stressed, well, now you know why. The inflammatory effects of stress can knock the stuffing out of our immune system. To be clear, humans are able to endure acute peaks of stress without lasting harm, and in fact, sometimes we're actually strengthened by the challenges that stress brings. But when stress is unrelenting, cemented into our lives, and we feel powerless to change it, that is when inflammation starts to really cause physiological damage. Now, we can go a long way in taking personal responsibility for de-inflaming ourselves. There are choices within our grasp. Do less. Go slower. Immerse yourself in nature. That's a definite anti-inflammatory. And music? God, yes. Always remember to use music as a medicine. It's impossible to overdose. It's also really important to adopt a grounding practice like meditation, enjoyable physical exercise and regular practices like yoga, dance or martial arts. Now those are the kinds of things that we can do for ourselves, and they are all potentially very anti-inflammatory. Now, I'm sure that you already know all of that, but I want to emphasize that if you're dealing with a lot of personal stress, the greatest anti-inflammatory is about nourishing relationships. And this is the part that you don't want to do alone. Do you allow yourself to reach out for support? Do you allow yourself to receive the support? For a social animal like us, the biggest inflammator is isolation, separation from tribe, from village, the absence of human touch. That can be in itself inflammatory. Most personal stresses can be greatly alleviated by connection. We need shared music. We need shared dance or arts. We need shared ritual, shared meals, shared purpose, shared devotion. Our bodies process stress and combat disease far, far more efficiently when we feel ourselves to be part of a loving community. Remember this, connection heals. Connection is what reverses inflammation. Healing is about connection. Connection is anti-inflammatory. Okay, now I'm starting to go off script here a little bit. This stuff was not exactly in the book. As a psychologist, of course, I could say much, much more about this, but I better get back on track. So, moving right along. And now here comes big inflammator number 7, collective stress. And here we come to one of the principal strengths of this book. What this book argues, and I think unimpeachably, is that when overwhelming stress and trauma impacts an entire group of people, whether it be a social class, an ethnic group, a colonized nation, or a minority, the responsibility for de-inflammation cannot be simply left up to the individual. It has to be shared. It has to be political. The book details the way that disadvantaged or oppressed groups, entire cohorts who are stuck in crushing cycles of debt, massive overwork just to barely get by, or with no access to clean air or healthy food, etc. People in that kind of position can find it impossible to lift themselves out of inflammatory circumstances. And I think the authors are really challenging us here and saying, if you were living in one of the poorest neighborhoods, if you were having to work 3 jobs just to make rent, if you lived in a car or in a slum, or were a member of a colonized group, or in a war-ravaged zone, or doing back-breaking work for barely a subsistence wage, do you really believe that you could lift yourself up by your bootstraps? There are hugely inflammatory burdens that are very disproportionately carried by people at the bottom of the inequality pyramid. And when you see the author's research, the picture becomes really clear and very disturbing. Inflammatory disease rates of all kinds, and therefore immune system failures, are much worse amongst poor and oppressed groups. So in a pandemic, these cracks really begin to show up, especially starkly. In fact, the COVID death rates were much higher, unsurprisingly, in the more inflamed neighborhoods, where life itself was already more inflammatory. As measured by the Gini coefficient, that's Gini coefficient, which is an international index of wealth distribution and disparity, income inequality has been on the rise for decades in most Western countries. Extreme social inequality is an accelerant of mass chronic inflammation. Extreme inequality is a veritable gigafactory of avoidable disease and avoidable death at a great cost to all of society. So it's really pointless for us to be wringing our hands about the runaway levels of chronic disease, the falls in average life expectancy, and the mushrooming costs of health, while at the same time doing all the structural stuff that's guaranteed to bake inflammation into our societies. Our epidemic of inflammation did not come out of thin air. We created it. by stressing the hell out of entire demographic cohorts of people. Want less inflammation in the world? Stop inflaming the world. It's plain as day. To de-inflame our populations, we need a regulated redistribution of opportunity. A reversal of the geyser-like trickle-up effect that funneled wealth to the very pointy top and opened a cavernous divide between the health haves and the health have-nots. But the good news is, the inflammation model of medicine says that we can sharply reduce chronic disease by spending money willingly on opportunity, rather than be forced to spend it on late-stage chronic disease, disability and death. Prevention isn't only about justice, it also makes economic sense. To redistribute is to de-inflame. Just a few of the excellent tried and tested options might be a universal basic income, a solid commitment to universal housing, zero homelessness, a return to free or at least very affordable education for everyone, including tertiary, a shorter working week, and a fair, decent minimum wage. Now, several studies have shown that a shorter work week can maintain or even improve overall productivity. It certainly improves health. So how do we pay for all of this? Well, actually, the real question we should be asking is, how the hell do we pay for the tax holidays and massive subsidies drained by the biggest corporations? What's the bet that reductions in the national health expenditure and the productivity boost from better health would more than adequately cover the cost of anti-inflammatory initiatives? So, what do you think? Combine this with a more equitable taxation regime and a closing of the corporate tax evasion loopholes, and wouldn't we be in for a big windfall for health, for well-being, as well as for the economy? Now, I'd love to hear your opinions about that in the comments below. So now onto the big inflammator number 8, and that is childhood developmental trauma. Now this bit, by the way, is my own addition, and I'm now going to stray momentarily from the content of this book. This bit comes from my own area of expertise as a psychologist, psychotherapist, and child development researcher and writer. But I think it fits logically with the spirit of this book. So, whereas these authors are concerned about the colonization of societies, of cultures, and perhaps the colonization by corporate entities, I am equally concerned with what I think is the colonization of childhood. And that is essentially what my first book was about, Parenting for a Peaceful World. Okay, so in our first 7 years of life, roughly speaking, our adaptive immune systems are still maturing. And in our first 3 years, our brains are growing at the fastest rate that they will grow in our lifespan. This makes us especially vulnerable during early childhood, especially vulnerable to long-term impacts from psychological and developmental traumas. That's why childhood matters so much. Childhood trauma needs to be understood separately because it has such an especially long-lasting effect psychologically and physiologically. Childhood is when our stress response and our immune response are being shaped. In parts 3 and 4 of this series, I talked about how unhealed childhood trauma is a proven generator of chronic inflammatory disease. Psychological trauma goes straight to the gut, and childhood trauma is a major factor in chronic inflammation. Now, it would take me all day to go into detail on this issue, and I've already strayed far enough from the scope of this book, but childhood trauma is way too important an inflammator to leave out. And there's so much that we can do to avoid the most common inflammatory blows that threaten us in early life. So for our children, our grandchildren, and coming generations, I'm going to be brief. This won't be an exhaustive list. I'll just mention a few of the most powerful initiatives, all evidence-based, that set children up for a much lower risk of chronic disease from the very beginning and for the rest of their lives. In other words, how can we best prime our children's immune systems? First, strong support for natural and vaginal birth. Caesarean rates have escalated shockingly, way beyond what authorities say is actually warranted. The World Health Organization recommended rates are between 10% to 15%. In Australia, it's over 40%. In the USA, it's over 30%. In parts of Latin America, it's over 50% and even more. Now note, caesarean section is a life-saving intervention when it is actually necessary. An upward trend in any unnecessary surgery should be cause for alarm. But now that we've understood that as a baby passes through the birth canal, through their skin and through their mouths, they receive a critical infusion of healthy bacteria from the mother that will seed their gut microbiome. Skipping this vital kickstarter for the baby's gut has been a significant contributor to chronic gut dysfunction and chronic inflammation. Now, some practitioners have begun to try to remedy this by swabbing the baby's body with their mother's vaginal fluids after a caesarean. But for a whole A to Z of reasons, experts are calling for a return to non-traumatic and non-interventionist childbirth. In fact, we generally need to supply much more support for expectant mothers. There's plenty of good evidence that even prenatal stress compromises the child's gut microbiome. What happens to the mother also happens to the unborn child. So protecting parents is the best investment because it results in a healthier gut for the child long term. Next, we need to help mothers to get all the support they need to be able to sustain full-term breastfeeding. How about, for instance, generously paid maternity leave, as they enjoy in Scandinavian countries? This would make a huge anti-inflammatory difference. There's nothing in the world like mother's milk for priming a child's immune system. It would be impossible for me to list all the benefits here, but they include vital antibodies and fantastic doses of the most beneficial gut bacteria that are needed in order to seed the child's microbiome. And it really works. Exclusively breastfed babies have a healthier microbiome and therefore better protection against disease. Unsurprisingly, formula-fed babies have a tendency to have a higher risk of developing obesity, asthma, eczema, the typical symptoms associated with an inflamed gut. Now, that's talking about averages across large numbers. It doesn't affect every individual child in exactly the same way. And good God, how we need to give parents all of the support they need to be able to provide an environment of healthy attachment for their children. Generously paid parental leave, I'll say it again, to support healthy early attachment would be an absolute game changer for the child's immune health. Like in Sweden, where parents are given 480 days of leave at 80% of their existing pre-birth salaries. Now we're talking. When babies and children feel emotionally secure, this gives them so much more than a joyous start to life. It can go a long way to insulating them from a host of chronic inflammatory diseases for the lifespan. Now, in earlier episodes, I mentioned the gigantic, groundbreaking studies looking at the impacts of adverse childhood experiences. What we now know irrefutably about childhood trauma places children's psychological welfare at the very heart of health. Taking care of children's emotional well-being is the primary concern in regulating and shaping their immune and inflammatory responses for life, which means health is first and foremost psychological health. The centrality of childhood relationships for all future health outcomes is increasingly a mainstream idea. One of the strongest advocates, in fact, for a childhood-aware approach to public health was Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who was a recent Surgeon General for California. But many, many more are following, because the evidence is just that overwhelming. Childhood trauma is the first culprit in our wave of chronic disease. And this culprit is, and should be, avoidable. It doesn't mean that we don't have healing available for individuals who have suffered trauma in childhood. But it's a no-brainer. Prevention is so much better than cure. So the very first thing that we need to do as a society to eliminate or reduce chronic inflammatory statistics starts with childhood and family policy. Loss, emotional neglect, premature separation, insecure beginnings, or violence at home, these are the greatest drivers of inflammation. There is nothing like feeling cherished, feeling safe emotionally, feeling like we belong, feeling like people really listen to us, to give us the best chance at a well-regulated and strong immune system for life. Love conditions the immune system better than anything else. The word is out. It is widely accepted that healthy attachment in the early years is the most important pillar of a lifetime of health. If stress and trauma impair the gut microbiome, loving attention and a sense of security and belonging give a tremendous boost to the ecology of the human gut and therefore to the growing immune system. Healthy attachment equals strong immunity. The science is conclusive. Love is the ultimate anti-inflammatory. And love needs time and consistent demonstration. Parents and grandparents are our front-line health workers against inflammation. So for them to be able to demonstrate and enact the love they feel, they need more time. They need more space. They need more support. And that's a matter of family policy. Early childhood is vital, but so is what happens afterwards. So we need to help parents and school teachers evolve away from the old authoritarian child-rearing practices that relied on punishment, manipulation, and shaming. And in fact, that's already happening around the world. National bans on the corporal punishment of children are here. These legal bans remove any legitimization of violence against children, such as reasonable chastisement or discipline, that kind of thing. And so it's now illegal for parents to smack or in any other way strike their children in a total of 68 countries all around the world. And also in 137 countries, they have banned the corporal punishment of children in schools. Both of these lists are growing every year. We're moving towards a global ban. So parental assertion and guidance, clear and solid behavioural boundaries, do not require old-fashioned punishment approaches. Children should not live in fear. There's nothing worse for inflammation. So the best way to protect their children's gut health is to protect their emotional health. And this in turn gives them the best possible immune system so their inflammation responses will be balanced. So let's go back to what I said at the beginning of this video. If your healthy diet, exercise and clean air aren't reducing inflammatory symptoms in your body, don't despair. There might be psychological root causes contributing to your inflamed state. So please consider that making life changes that maximize your joy, that reduce your emotional stress, that connect you more deeply in loving relationships, These things are just as important, if not more important, than any diet. It's also feasible that unexamined childhood traumas have unsettled your gut, so some support for psychological healing may be called for. And remember, prevention is always far more desirable than cure. Don't wait for symptoms to show up before you decide to live a more anti-inflammatory life. Lastly, healing is ultimately shared. Think about how you might like to contribute to helping others, especially people who can't fully help themselves, to live a life free of inflammatory pressure. I hope my videos have shown you that there are so very many options for how any of us can make a big difference personally, communally, politically. All of us have a gift, a unique way to contribute. How would you like to help de-inflame the world? Okay, if you're enjoying these videos, I'd love for you to hit the like button. Subscribe to this channel and share the video with your friends. It costs nothing, but it makes a huge difference in helping me to keep this work going and to share these empowering ideas for how we can de-inflame the world. Thank you. Now, there's going to be one last episode, part 6, the closing chapter of my discussion about this wonderful book, Inflamed, with plenty more exciting things to talk about that this book implies for our lives. But don't forget, I'll be reviewing other books for the Paradigm Shifters Club as well, so stay tuned, subscribe to this channel and to my Substack, and the address of my Substack is below. So until the next episode, adios.